Hey everyone, we're going to be talking about sexting today. It's something that seems to be on everyone's mind these days, and we're going to be taking a deep dive into how it impacts our relationships, especially when it comes to trust, connection, and
Cool.
jealousy. We've got some really interesting research to share with you, and one of the things that surprised me was that sexting can actually be a positive thing for couples. It can even strengthen trust. But of course, it really depends on how it's done. So how do we make sure sexting doesn't turn into a relationship disaster? That's what we're here to unpack.
Well, trust is the foundation of any relationship. And sexting, it can either build that foundation up or it can completely destroy it.
Mm.
It all comes down to how couples approach it.
And so not so much the sexting itself, it's more about the approach and how couples handle it.
No, it's about those ground rules, having that
Yeah.
open communication.
Consent.
Consent and respect are absolutely key. It's
Mhm.
like building a house. You
Mm.
need those solid supports to keep it standing.
Yeah. And thinking about trust. Just imagine discovering that your partner has been secretly sexting someone else. Even if the messages aren't super explicit, that sense of betrayal, I can't even imagine.
Absolutely. It cuts deep. You're right. It's not just about what's being said. It's that secrecy, that lack of transparency that really shatters trust. And actually, one of the studies we looked at found that couples who talk openly about their boundaries around sexting reported feeling more secure in their relationships. They knew where they stood with each other. And that honesty actually built a stronger bond.
That makes a lot of sense. So open communication is key for building trust. But what about connection? How does sexting impact how close we feel to our partner?
It can definitely impact that. And it's interesting because it can go both ways. Sexting can either enhance that connection or it can create distance. For couples who are long distance or can't be physically intimate as often as they'd like, sexting can be a really helpful way to maintain that closeness and that sense of intimacy. But it's important to make sure both partners are on the same page about what feels good and what might cross the line.
Okay, so it can work, but it can also backfire.
Yeah.
So how does sexting end up creating distance for some couples?
Well, if one partner is uncomfortable with sexting, or if they feel like it's replacing real life intimacy, that's when problems can start to arise.
So it's like using a Band-Aid, when what you really need to do is address the underlying issue.
Exactly. It's important for couples to ask themselves, is this enhancing our connection? Or are we using this to avoid dealing with something deeper?
Right, and again, it highlights the importance of communication, making sure you're both on the same page about what you want and what you need. Now let's talk about something that I think a lot of people can relate to: jealousy. Sexting can be a major trigger for jealousy, especially when you start to worry about cheating or feeling inadequate.
Absolutely. Jealousy is a natural human emotion. But in this context, it often points to deeper insecurities within the relationship or even within ourselves.
It's like that one example we saw in the research, where even a flirty text to a friend was enough to spark intense jealousy in one of the partners.
Yeah. I think it's a good reminder that we need to get to the root of those insecurities. If we can build a stronger foundation for the relationship and for our own self-worth, we'll be much better equipped to handle these situations.
So it's not just about telling ourselves to not be jealous, it's about understanding where those feelings are coming from.
Exactly. And that's where clear boundaries and open communication becomes so crucial.
I think that's a great point to pause for now.
Yeah. Let's take a break and come back with some real-life examples of how all of this plays out in real relationships.
I think it's safe to say we've all been there, right? Where our phones are basically glued to our hands. So let's talk about how this always connected world is impacting our relationships.
Oh, yeah. It's a huge factor these days. Technology is woven into pretty much every aspect of our lives. And our relationships are definitely no exception, especially romantic ones.
And while sexting can be a fun way to add some spice to things, it also opens up this whole other can of worms.
Totally. It's like navigating a whole new set of rules, figuring out where the lines are, what's okay, and what crosses the line.
It's interesting because what might seem harmless to one person could be a major red flag for someone else.
Exactly. And that's where communication becomes even more crucial. We really need to understand our partner's perspective and their sensitivities to make sure we're both on the same page about what's acceptable within the relationship.
Which brings us back to trust, right? If you're constantly worried about what your partner's doing online, it can really eat away at the foundation of the relationship.
You hit the nail on the head. Trust and security go hand in hand. When you truly trust your partner, you feel safe and secure in the relationship.
And that security allows you to be more vulnerable and open, which can actually lead to a deeper connection.
It's like this amazing positive cycle. But when that trust is broken, it can be incredibly difficult to rebuild.
For sure. So we need to be really mindful of how our actions online can impact our offline relationships. Every message, every photo we send has the potential to affect our partner deeply.
It's all about being intentional with our digital communication, remembering that there's a real person with real feelings on the other side of the screen.
Shifting gears a bit, I'm curious about the role self-esteem plays in all of this.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Remember how we talked about jealousy often stemming from deeper insecurities?
Yeah, those doubts we have about ourselves or the relationship.
Right. And when those insecurities are already present, sexting can really amplify them.
So if you're already feeling insecure about your body, for example, seeing your partner sexting with anyone, even in a harmless way, could really send you into a spiral.
It's like pouring salt on an open wound. It taps into those vulnerabilities that we might already have.
So what can we do about it? How can we boost our self-esteem and feel more secure, both in ourselves and in our relationships?
That's a big question, and one that probably deserves a whole deep dive of its own. But I think the first step is recognizing that self-esteem comes from within.
So it's not about seeking validation from others or comparing ourselves to what we see online.
Exactly. It's about accepting and valuing ourselves, including our flaws.
Remembering that our worthiness of love and belonging isn't tied to how we look or how many likes we get on social media.
It's about cultivating self-love and compassion for ourselves, which I know might sound a little cheesy, but it's incredibly powerful.
It's definitely easier said than done, but it's so worth it.
Absolutely. When we feel good about ourselves, we're less likely to get caught up in those negative thought patterns that fuel jealousy and insecurity.
Which makes us better equipped to navigate the ups and downs of any relationship, especially those that involve sexting. So how do we actually put this into practice? How can we boost our self-esteem in a tangible way?
Well, one really powerful strategy is to challenge those negative self-talk patterns that we all have.
You mean that voice in our head that tells us we're not good enough, pretty enough, successful enough?
Exactly. We need to learn to recognize those negative thoughts
Yeah.
and consciously replace them with more positive and realistic ones.
So instead of dwelling on what we perceive as flaws, we shift our focus to our strengths and accomplishments.
It's about reframing how we see ourselves and choosing to focus on the good.
And it also means surrounding ourselves with people who support us and lift us up, people who remind us of our worth.
You're absolutely right. The people we spend our time with have a huge impact on how we feel about ourselves. They can either build us up or tear us down, so it's important to choose those relationships wisely.
Before we wrap up this part, I want to talk about something that's almost impossible to avoid these days: social media. It can be a breeding ground for comparison and insecurity.
It's true, social media often feels like this highlight reel of everyone else's perfect life, which can make us feel inadequate in comparison.
It can make it seem like everyone else is happier, more successful, more attractive.
And it's important to remember that what we see online is just a curated version of reality. People tend to showcase their best selves, hiding their struggles and insecurities.
So how do we navigate the world of social media without letting it damage our self-esteem and our relationships?
I think the first step is being mindful of how much time you're spending on social media. It's so easy to get sucked into that endless scroll, which can drain your energy and leave you feeling depleted.
Definitely. Maybe setting some limits like scheduling specific times for social media or taking regular breaks could be helpful.
Absolutely. And be really intentional about who you follow. Unfollow those accounts that make you feel bad about yourself or trigger those feelings of jealousy and comparison.
And surround yourself with content that inspires and uplifts you instead.
Remember, you are not defined by your online presence. Your worth is inherent regardless of how many likes or followers you have.
Those are really great tips. I think that's a good reminder for all of us.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the digital world, but it's so important to stay grounded in reality.
And to prioritize our mental and emotional well-being above all else.
Before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Consider the power of vulnerability.
In the context of sexting and relationships.
Exactly. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with our partners, sharing our true selves, flaws and all, it opens up the possibility for a much deeper level of intimacy and connection.
It's about trusting that our partners will love and accept us unconditionally.
Which I know can be terrifying, but it can also be incredibly liberating.
Because when we let go of that need to be perfect, we open ourselves up to a whole new level of authenticity and genuine connection.
And that's where the real magic happens.
That's a really powerful thought to carry with us.
And one that we'll continue exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, we're back. and ready to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground talking about trust and connection and self-esteem, but there's one more piece of this sexting puzzle we need to talk about.
Yeah, boundaries are super important.
Exactly. They're like those invisible fences that help protect our emotional well-being in any relationship, really.
You can think of boundaries as your personal guidelines for what you're comfortable with, what feels safe for you.
And when it comes to sexting, having clear boundaries is absolutely essential.
It's easy to get caught up in the moment, you know, and send a message or a photo without really thinking it through.
And what might seem totally fine to one person could be a huge deal for someone else.
Right. That's why it's so important to have those conversations beforehand, to set some ground rules with your partner about what you're both comfortable with.
So what are some examples of those boundaries that couples should talk about when it comes to sexting?
Well, it can be anything, really. It could be the types of messages that are okay or off limits, or even the times of day when sexting is appropriate.
So like one person might be cool with sexting during the day, but the other person only feels comfortable with it at night.
Exactly. Or maybe one person is okay with sharing certain types of photos while the other person isn't.
It's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
that shared understanding of what works for both people.
And remember, boundaries can change over time.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
What might have felt okay at the beginning of a relationship could feel totally different a year or two down the road.
Exactly. Relationships evolve, and so do our comfort levels. The key is to keep those lines of communication open.
To check in with each other regularly and make sure you're both still on the same page.
Because boundaries aren't about trying to control or restrict your partner.
It's not about that at all.
It's about creating that space of safety and respect within the relationship.
A space where you both feel comfortable and secure.
And that's the foundation for true intimacy to flourish.
I love that.
Okay.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into sexting, trust, and jealousy, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
You know, I think it's important to remember the power we have to use technology intentionally.
When it comes to sexting.
Sexting, communication, everything. We don't have to let technology run the show. We can choose to use it as a tool to build stronger and healthier connections.
To bridge the distance, deepen our intimacy, express our love and affection.
Exactly. It's about being mindful and intentional with how we use technology in our relationships.
And remembering that there's a real person with real feelings on the other side of every screen.
So let's make a conscious effort to use technology in a way that honors those feelings.
To build each other up, support each other, and create a space of love and respect.
Because at the end of the day, that's what truly matters.
Well said. That's a fantastic note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into sexting, trust, and jealousy.
It's been a pleasure. I hope you all found it helpful.
And remember, open communication, clear boundaries, and mutual respect are the foundation of any healthy relationship.
Absolutely.
And technology, when used intentionally, can be a powerful tool to strengthen those connections.
I hope you'll all keep these conversations going with your partners.
Until next time, stay curious.